On the surface, the Moselle property looked peaceful. Long stretches of land, tall trees, a sense of separation from the outside world. It was the kind of place built for privacy, tradition, and control. For decades, the Murdaugh name carried weight across South Carolina's low country. Courtrooms, law firms, and local institutions all knew it well. Generations of prosecutors and attorneys had come from the same family. That legacy shaped expectations and shaped behavior. At the center of that world was Alex Murdaugh. To many, he was approachable and friendly, a lawyer who joked easily and remembered names, someone who seemed firmly embedded in the community he served. From a distance, his life looked stable, a successful legal career, a long marriage, 2 sons moving into adulthood, a large property used for hunting and family gatherings. Nothing suggested collapse. But appearances often hide pressure, and pressure, when ignored long enough, does not disappear, it builds. Alex grew up inside the legal system. He learned its rules early. More importantly, he learned how power works in small communities. Who to call, what to say, when patience mattered more than honesty. This case teaches us something essential. Long-term privilege can distort reality. When consequences rarely arrive, people begin to believe they never will. Maggie Murdaugh was known as private and reserved. She preferred a quieter life than the one surrounding her family name. Friends described her as practical and focused on family. She did not seek attention. Paul Murdaugh, the younger son, was impulsive and unpredictable. That reputation would matter later. At the time, it was already creating strain within the family. Several years earlier, Paul had been involved in a boating incident that ended another young person's life. The case drew intense scrutiny. Lawsuits followed. Media attention grew. For the first time, the Murdaugh name faced sustained public pressure. That pressure mattered. From a psychological perspective, unresolved legal stress can destabilize even well-established identities, especially when reputation has always been a shield. Alex took the role of fixer. He reassured family members. He managed narratives. He projected confidence. That pattern had worked before. But this time was different. Behind the scenes, finances were tightening. Years of questionable decisions were catching up. Money that should have been untouchable was already gone. That reality stayed hidden from most people. Experts who later studied this case noted a familiar pattern. When individuals depend on status to survive, exposure becomes a threat to identity itself. At Moselle, routines mattered. Alex valued predictability. Control over environment, control over timing, control over outcomes. That need for control is a key warning sign, especially when paired with growing chaos beneath the surface. Friends notice changes, subtle ones, increased stress, shorter patience, more defensiveness. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious. That is often how collapse begins. This case teaches us that warning signs rarely arrive all at once. They emerge quietly. They hide behind normalcy. On the afternoon of June 7th, the day unfolded without alarm. Messages were sent. Plans were discussed. Nothing suggested urgency. Later that evening, Alex said he visited Moselle briefly, then left, then returned. Those movements would become central later. At the time, they meant nothing. What mattered more was the emotional context. Financial pressure, legal exposure, fear of losing control. From a psychological perspective, these stressors compound. Each one narrows options. Each one increases desperation. People who believe they can talk their way out of anything often struggle when words stop working. Another detail seemed unimportant then. Maggie had been spending more time away from Moselle. She preferred staying elsewhere. That choice reflected discomfort. Discomfort, experts later suggested, often precedes awareness. Even when people cannot name the threat, they feel it. Paul, meanwhile, faced an uncertain future. Court proceedings loomed. Public opinion had turned harsh. The family's protective bubble was weakening. For Alex, everything converged at once. Legal risk, financial exposure, family tension, public scrutiny. This is where psychology matters most. When identity collapses, behavior can shift rapidly, especially in individuals accustomed to control. That night, the house was quiet. The property sat in darkness. The routine felt familiar. But routine can be deceptive. Investigators later said nothing about that evening looked dramatic at first glance. No alarms, no frantic calls, just silence. Silence, however, is not peace. Sometimes it is pressure reaching a breaking point. This case teaches us that the most dangerous moments often look ordinary, especially when they occur behind closed doors. As night settled in, no one outside Moselle knew anything was wrong. Phones stayed quiet, roads remained empty. Inside the family system, however, stress had nowhere left to go. By the time that night ended, the Murdaugh name would never be the same. The community would be forced to re-examine what it thought it knew. And investigators would soon realize that what looked like a family tragedy was something far more complex. Because when they began asking questions, one thing became clear. The story they were given could not hold. And that was only the beginning. The call came in late that evening. Alex Murdaugh reported finding his wife and son on the Moselle property. His voice sounded strained, controlled. But urgency was there. Law enforcement arrived to a scene that felt unusually quiet. No signs of forced entry, no clear indication of what had led to this moment, just questions. From the beginning, investigators approached carefully. This was a prominent family, a respected attorney, familiar faces on both sides of the badge. That familiarity mattered. This case teaches us that proximity can complicate objectivity, especially in small communities where relationships overlap. Alex explained that he had been away earlier that evening. He said he had checked on his mother. He said he returned later and made the discovery. At first glance, the explanation sounded reasonable. Timelines often do, especially when details are still forming. But timelines are fragile things. They only work if every piece aligns. Officers began documenting the area. Vehicles, phones, surroundings, everything was treated as routine. Yet something felt off. Experienced investigators later said the emotional tone did not match expectations. Not wrong, not theatrical, just inconsistent. From a psychological perspective, people react to shock differently. But patterns still exist. Alex spoke clearly. He repeated key points. He emphasized his movements. He framed events in a specific order. That repetition mattered. This case teaches us that when stress is extreme, people cling to rehearsed narratives. Consistency becomes a defense. Meanwhile, the community reacted with disbelief. News spread quickly. Sympathy poured in. Few questioned the account. At that stage, there was no reason to. Investigators reviewed phone data, message timestamps, call logs, small details that often tell larger stories. Early analysis revealed activity near the time Alex claimed he was elsewhere. Nothing definitive, just enough to note there was just one problem with his story. The window of time he described was shrinking. From a cognitive standpoint, compressed timelines increase risk. Each added detail must fit perfectly. Any deviation becomes obvious. Investigators also noticed Alex's focus during interviews. He redirected attention. He volunteered explanations before questions were asked. Experts later explained this behavior. When individuals feel control slipping, they try to steer conversations. This pattern is commonly seen in high-pressure interrogations. At the same time, a separate issue surfaced. Financial auditors began reviewing Alex's professional records. That review was unrelated at first, or so it seemed. Discrepancies emerged quickly. Client funds missing, settlements diverted, long-term patterns of misuse. This changed everything. The case was no longer isolated. It was expanding. This case teaches us how layered investigations work. One inquiry often unlocks another. As financial pressure became public, the emotional context shifted. Stress was no longer hypothetical. Exposure was imminent. Investigators revisited earlier assumptions. They re-examined timelines. They reviewed digital movements again. Phone data showed activity Alex had not mentioned. Subtle actions, short windows, critical moments, each one narrowed options. From a psychological perspective, this is where collapse accelerates. Once inconsistencies surface, cognitive load increases sharply. Maintaining deception requires effort. Under pressure, effort fails. Law enforcement began coordinating across departments. What started as a response became a structured investigation. Community perception began to change. Quietly at first, then more openly. This shift matters. Social pressure often precedes legal consequences. Investigators noticed another detail. Alex's behavior after the event focused heavily on sympathy and reassurance, less on curiosity. That imbalance raised questions. This case teaches us that genuine confusion often drives people to ask questions. Deception tends to offer answers instead. As evidence accumulated, investigators understood something critical. This was not just about what happened that night, it was about everything leading up to it. And as financial investigators closed in, the narrative Alex had relied on for years began to fail. The protective structures around him were weakening. Soon, investigators would look at the evidence with fresh eyes, and when they did, the case would change forever. Once financial investigators became involved, the case entered a new phase. What had appeared contained was now expanding in multiple directions. Records revealed years of concealed misconduct, settlement money redirected, clients misled, trust quietly abused. The scale surprised even seasoned investigators. From a psychological perspective, long-term deception requires compartmentalization. People convince themselves that tomorrow will fix what today broke, but tomorrow eventually arrives. As financial pressure intensified, law enforcement re-examined every digital trace from the night at Moselle: phone data, vehicle movement, message activity. This time, patterns emerged more clearly. Alex's phone showed periods of silence followed by bursts of activity. Small actions, short windows, moments that contradicted his earlier statements. Each discrepancy mattered. This case teaches us that technology does not forget. Digital behavior often reveals what memory tries to conceal. Investigators focused on a critical time window, a span when Alex said he was not near Moselle. Data suggested otherwise. At first, the difference seemed minor. Minutes matter, but context matters more. Then came the breakthrough. Audio data placed Alex's voice at the property during a time he had denied being there. Casual conversation, familiar tones, unaware it would later become pivotal. This single detail shifted the entire case. From an investigative standpoint, this was decisive. From a psychological standpoint, it was devastating. Experts later explained why. Deception often fails during moments of comfort. People relax. They forget the story they are maintaining. That is when truth slips through. As evidence mounted, Alex's behavior changed. He appeared more erratic, less controlled. Pressure was no longer manageable. Colleagues noticed agitation. Friends described emotional swings. His long-standing confidence fractured. This pattern aligns with narcissistic collapse. When identity depends on status, exposure feels existential. Investigators reconstructed the sequence of events carefully. They matched data points. They tested alternative explanations. None held. Callbacks planted earlier now paid off. Alex's obsession with routine became his weakness. Deviation stood out clearly. His belief in immunity failed against objective evidence. At this stage, law enforcement no longer treated the case as ambiguous. The focus narrowed. When Alex was formally charged, the response was mixed. Shock for some, validation for others. But even then, one question remained unresolved. Why? Why would someone risk everything in a single night? This case teaches us that understanding behavior matters as much as proving facts. As the legal process moved forward, investigators prepared to answer that question in court, and in doing so, they would expose not just what happened, but what had been unraveling for years. The final chapter would no longer be about evidence alone. It would be about motive, identity, and collapse. And that explanation would change how this case was remembered forever. The trial forced everything into the open. Years of secrecy gave way to structured examination. Evidence replaced reputation. Jurors heard how financial misconduct escalated quietly, how exposure arrived suddenly, how control slipped faster than anyone expected. From a psychological perspective, the pattern was clear. This was not an impulsive act. It was a collapse. Experts explained that family annihilation often follows perceived total loss: status, income, identity. When all three fail at once, risk increases sharply. Alex faced consequences on every front. His career was ending. His finances were exposed. His public image was shattered. That convergence matters. This case teaches us that catastrophic decisions often occur when individuals believe there is no path forward. In court, timelines were reconstructed carefully. Digital data contradicted earlier narratives. Objective records carried more weight than words. The jury did not need speculation. The evidence told its own story. When the verdict came, it closed one chapter. But understanding required more than judgment. Why did no one intervene earlier? The answer lies in systems, small communities, deference to power, assumptions that influence equals integrity. Warning signs were present: financial secrecy, emotional volatility, increasing isolation. Each one alone seemed manageable. Together, they formed a dangerous